Montgomery slammed his fist onto the war table and demanded Patton be removed. Within days, the message reached MacArthur, who fired back with a reply so ruthless and shocking that it silenced the entire Allied command. The wind across the French countryside howled like a warning as tanks churned mud and smoke into the air. The war had entered one of its ugliest, most unpredictable phases, and behind the plumes of artillery fire, rivalries that had simmered quietly among the Allied high command were now on the brink of exploding into open crisis. When Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery demanded General George Patton's head, figuratively, politically, and in the language of wartime vindication, the message flew across headquarters and into the ears of the one man who could either silence the chaos or turn the Allied command into a battlefield of its own, General Douglas MacArthur. Few knew what he would say, fewer expected the answer, and no one was prepared for the shockwave it created. It began not in Washington or London, but in a muddy tent pitched beyond Caen, where British officers whispered grievances in clipped tones. Montgomery's campaign had dragged longer than expected, the German defense had proven harsher than his planners predicted, and pressure from Churchill and the War Office had pushed him towards bold claims of future victories. Meanwhile, Patton, loud, brash, bloodthirsty for action, had sliced through German lines with a speed that embarrassed every other commander on the Western Front. Soldiers joked that Patton's tanks ran on octane, but the staff officers muttered that he ran on ego. To Montgomery, it looked less like brilliance and more like insubordination that threatened the careful choreography of the Allied plan. "He is reckless, uncontrollable, and dangerous to unified command," Montgomery fumed to his staff one rain-slick morning. "This army cannot be commanded by two Napoleons. One must serve the strategy." He meant himself. He always meant himself. Within an hour the words were drafted, sealed, and sent up the chain, a formal demand that Patton be removed from operational command. In Montgomery's eyes, it was the only way to preserve order. To others, it was a thinly masked strike at a rival whose successes cast too much shadow. When the request reached Eisenhower's headquarters, the Supreme Commander held it a long moment before speaking. He leaned back in his chair, cigarette burning between his fingers, and exhaled smoke like a weary soldier instead of the general who held the fate of the Western War in his hands. "Monty never asks for half measures," he muttered. "He wants Patton off the board entirely." His staff exchanged quiet glances. Everyone knew the rivalry between the two was legendary. Eisenhower had long been forced to act as a referee between two prima donnas who happened to wield armies. But demanding Patton's removal was a different order of magnitude. If Eisenhower granted it, the shock would ripple through the ranks like artillery. If he refused, the British might see it as favoritism, and London might bristle. But Eisenhower was not the only figure Montgomery's message traveled to. Through diplomatic channels, political gossip, and military cables, word seeped eastward, past secretaries and colonels, until it reached General Douglas MacArthur, far away in the Pacific, fighting a different war yet always attuned to the egos and ambitions of his fellow commanders. MacArthur read the message once, twice, and then slowly folded it with the precision of a man accustomed to weighing the fate of armies. Patton's reputation had reached him long ago. They had never served in the same theater, but they understood each other in the unspoken language of warriors who saw combat not as a science but as a performance, bloody, ruthless, and grand. Patton chased battles like a hunter, MacArthur staged them like a dramatist. Montgomery, by contrast, viewed war as a puzzle, one that must be solved with order, containment, and theory. Meanwhile, the rumor that Montgomery wanted Patton removed spread through Allied ranks like fire through parched grass. American soldiers spat curses when they heard it, British troops smirked knowingly, French officers rolled their eyes and muttered that generals were more jealous than poets. Patton himself received the news with the cold amusement of a man who had spent too many years being underestimated. He summoned his staff, poured a drink, and announced with theatrical dryness, "Monty wants my head. He can have it, if he catches me first." Then his tone shifted, steel beneath the swagger. "Let him come. I do not intend to slow down until Berlin." What Montgomery had not counted on was the effect the controversy would have on the men in the field. Soldiers admired Patton not because he was courteous, but because he was furious, relentless, and unafraid to spend his own life as carelessly as theirs. A soldier once said Patton looked like war carved into stone. To remove such a man in the middle of Europe's final crucible seemed madness. Eisenhower deliberated for days, torn between strategy and unity. Churchill, upon hearing of Montgomery's demand, paced and barked into telephones, furious that infighting might derail the momentum the Allies had earned with blood. "We cannot win a war and lose peace among ourselves," he thundered. But the shock came when MacArthur's formal reply arrived. Eisenhower read it aloud to a select group, and by the end, not a soul in the room spoke. MacArthur, never one to waste words, had crafted a response that cut through politics like a blade. "If success on the battlefield is a crime," he wrote, "then hang Patton before the army. But remember this, history makes no room for generals who win slowly." It was a dagger pointed straight at Montgomery's philosophy. MacArthur continued with a cold logic that stripped the matter bare. "War is not a seminar in manners. It is a race against time, measured in coffins. Every day we delay to soothe vanity is a day bought in blood." Then, with a flourish only MacArthur could muster, he ended the message: "Do not punish the man who wins too quickly, lest you reward the man who wins too late." The room silently absorbed the words. Eisenhower exhaled, finally understanding what decision had already been made. The Allies could not afford envy. They could barely afford time. Patton would remain in command. When Montgomery was informed that his demand had been rejected and why, his jaw tightened and his eyes went dangerously cold. For a moment, he was the scholar of war insulted before his peers. But war does not pause for dignity. The German counterattacks along the Scheldt were intensifying, and Montgomery was needed more than his pride. He swallowed the insult like bitter medicine and returned to his maps. Patton never gloated. He did not need to. Battles were his celebration: Metz, the Saar, the dash to the Rhine. His tanks moved like a rolling thunderstorm, fast, unpredictable, merciless. As the Germans fell back and the Reich crumbled, Eisenhower's earlier hesitation seemed almost laughable. Men who feared Patton's aggression now prayed he would reach them before the Russians did. But what the world remembered was not simply the victory, it was the drama behind the curtain. That one commander demanded the removal of another in the middle of a world war, that the war itself bent under the weight of ego as much as strategy, that somewhere in the Pacific, a distant general issued a single response that preserved a rivalry but saved a campaign. History would later debate whether Montgomery's demand was tactical or personal, whether Patton's speed was brilliance or recklessness, and whether MacArthur's intervention was wisdom or theater. But the soldiers who crawled through mud, slept in bombed-out barns, and bled into foreign soil cared for none of it. They only knew that when Europe trembled in 1944, the generals bickered like kings and the war went on. When the final shots were fired and the last German cities fell silent, Montgomery and Patton met once more, not as enemies but as victors forced to share a stage neither wished to concede. Their handshake was brief, firm, and cold. But MacArthur, watching from across oceans as the Pacific War entered its own decisive finale, merely lit another pipe and observed, "History will forget the quarrel. It will remember the results." Yet he was wrong in one regard. History did not forget the quarrel. It whispered it across decades, a secret anecdote of a moment when pride nearly fractured victory, and when a single reply from a distant battlefield shocked everyone enough to keep the war pointed in the same direction.